Hey everybody, welcome to the Renovation Theory Podcast. This week is episode number 4. We're your hosts, I'm Pat, and this is Britt.
Hey everybody, today we're going to jump into kind of a topic that's been, I guess not directly discussed in the news a lot, but sort of in a roundabout way, and that's the idea of truth. So we want to talk a little bit about what are the different types of truth that we talk about, and how is that affected when it's brought up in the media, and how does not having sort of a, we're using a word that has a lot of different meanings in a lot of different contexts, and how can that kind of distort the conversation? So that's what we want to talk about today.
So, truth.
Yeah.
There's a loaded word.
Yeah, for sure.
It's an oddly loaded word, because when you say the word truth, you're like, oh yeah, it's a truth. That's not that big of a deal. Mm-hmm. But when we're talking about truth, and more specifically, more recently in the arena of news and politics specifically, especially, it becomes a very muddy, loaded word for whatever reason, and that's just because of the way it's been used, because of words around it. Fake news, alternative facts. They're obviously not talking about truth specifically, but
sure,
when those get thrown in there, you're talking about the same thing.
Right.
When President Donald Trump says something about the fake news, he's ultimately trying to discredit another news organization who is trying to report facts and truth.
Right.
Or when they talk about alternative facts, which are not facts. I'm willing to say that. Alternative facts are not facts. But when you throw that out there too, then you've got another layer of discrediting, of trying to push your opinion or your view of truth onto other people and getting other people behind that. It's become a very weird word to use, even though it shouldn't. Like when we say something is true, that's something that we should all be able to get behind and say, yes, that is true. Right.
I think I kind of alluded to it earlier, but it's one of those words in the English language. We don't need to get into the whole etymology stuff of, is that the right word?
Yeah.
Okay. Just second guess myself there for a second.
Entomology is bugs. Etymology is words.
Okay, cool. Got it. But, it's one of those words that when you really, even right now, when I'm looking at I was curious what the definition is, the quality of or state of being true, that which is true in accordance with fact or reality, or a fact or belief that is accepted as true. When you start breaking down what those things actually mean, that's a huge amount of weight in a language to be carried with a single word. That, right. And I think that's kind of where we get into some interesting discussions, especially when it comes to politics, because, there is this ability to twist the truth, and still present it in a way where people can kind of get on board with you, and present it as the truth and have people accept it.
So, not to interrupt, but
no.
So let's talk about facts versus truth.
Sure.
Like you said, twist the truth. I don't think there's twisting of the truth going on. I think there's twisting of facts, twisting of numbers, twisting of opinions, sure, twisting of a lot of other things, but can truth be twisted? You can twist facts, you can twist other things and present it as truth. But is that the truth?
Well, and I think that all goes back to how you define the truth. But to your point, I think facts shouldn't be able to be twisted. I mean, although that's hard, because you could look at a single stat and say, whatever the case may be, like, just off the top of my head, since we're talking about politics, like a rate of abortions or something like that. And depending on what side of the issue you're on, that single fact, though it may be the same exact fact, is presented in a different way to represent the argument that you're making. And in that case, the truth that you're presenting. What, inferring whichever side of that argument you'd be on.
Sure. So it's a matter of, if you see a stat, taking it at face value may mean one thing, but digging in, it may mean another thing.
Yeah, I think, there's a way to take a fact that we would all, it's scientifically proven or whatever it's provided by a reputable organization or whatever the case may be, and take that to work in favor of your argument, no matter what that argument is. So I think that's kind of where it turns into a slippery slope really, really fast, because we all use facts to our benefit, right? Like, we don't want facts that disprove our points of view.
Right. That kind of goes back to what we were talking about last week with personalities. When we get put in a box that we like, we're happy. But when we get put into a box that we don't like, or when somebody else puts us in a box, we don't like it, and we push against it. So is that, same thing. If we see a fact or a stat or opinion that lines up with ours, we're like, yeah, gung-ho about it. That totally makes sense. I'm going to put that out on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram because I love it. And some of my followers will love it too, but then some won't.
Right.
And then they just dismiss it as untrue or interpret it differently, or...
Mm-hmm. I think we've been kind of trained, thinking, I was never in debate, but what I assume you're trained in debate is, if it doesn't fit your argument, you don't bring it up, right? So ultimately, like, we are, and I think that's the same thing with writing papers or whatever. It's like, we're not going to put a counter argument into our own argument, which I think unless
you have a better argument to counter that counter argument.
Sure.
Like, if you're talking about something and there is a lot of people are going to bring up a counter argument against it, but you have a better counter argument. How many counters are we going to get in here? Then you could bring that up and disprove that counter argument.
But most people don't do that. And I think that's a fatal flaw, I guess, of discussion. And as we're talking about conversation, we tend to want to lean into the things that appeal to our perception of the story or truth.
Which is where fake news, not the fake news in the sense of... President Trump calling CNN or whatever fake news, but the fake news in the sense of legitimate twisting of facts in order to skew a news story to a specific audience. That's where that comes in, because then that specific audience, or people adjacent to that specific audience who are likely to believe that, read it, get on board with it, send it out to their friends and followers on social media. And I saw an article, I think it was in Inc.com, about a group of researchers analyzed tweets from 2006 to 2017, or it was about a 10-year span up until recently. And they had an independent fact-checking organization look at a lot of these links, a lot of the mass links that were being shared on on Twitter, and they found that the news articles that were discredited by this fact-checking organization spread way faster than articles that were the truth. And so there's just something in us, and the article didn't really give an explanation why. It basically said maybe it's just because of our biases, and when something more lines up with our individual thinking, we're more likely to share it. And it's presented as truth. It's presented as facts in those articles, and most of them are fairly well written if you're not digging too deeply into them. And so you could see it, and if you're not digging into who the source is or who the writer is, then you might not think anything of it. But for some reason in our brains, those fake news stories, those alternative facts, spread faster than the truth, which is, that's kind of sad, but that's where we're at. When something's tailored to us, we're like, yeah, I believe that. That's totally true. Right.
Well, and I think you hit on a good point that I was going to say, that I think we've become kind of lazy, honestly. Like, I think in our heads we know, because people make jokes about it all the time, like, oh, of course everything on the internet's true, and we know that, that it's not true, not always true. But then when we're presented with something that, like you said, especially when it aligns to what we already believe, then I think we sort of have this filter of like, well, I want it to be true, so I'm not going to put in the legwork to see if it is true because I just want to believe that it's true. And I think that's something that we have to get a lot better at checking ourselves and saying, okay, can I at least find a second article that from a reputable source that backs this up in some way, like if nothing else. But
it's weird that's our mindset going into it. Like, I can't tell you how many meetings I've been meetings I've been to at work, or just, talking at work or with friends or whatever, that somebody says, I saw this on the internet the other day, and me or somebody else brings up the point, oh, well, then it must be true. Jokingly, of course, because we know it doesn't have to be true. But it's like a throwaway something. If we agree with whatever that person read on the internet, we're like, oh yeah, that's true. So and then we immediately forget that it's on the internet and it doesn't have to be true.
Yeah.
But if it's something that we don't agree with, we're like, oh, that was just on the internet. Anybody can write anything on the internet. That doesn't have to be true.
Yeah, and it's funny, it's perpetuated in small ways too. Like I've definitely been in meetings over several years of working where people maybe throw out a random fact that maybe like they've read at one point and it could have been true, but then it's like, because it's not directly quoted or it's just being recalled by memory, it's like true-ish, and the sentiment is probably fine, but the exact like number statistic or the way it was phrased or whatever might get lost in translation. And in situations like that, I don't think it's particularly harmful, but I think there can be situations where it turns into a really bad thing for people. And whether it's we switch the words around in the wrong order, or, you're not providing the correct context for whatever the
newest statistic. Sure. Like, we can't be going off of stats from 5 years ago in some cases.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, a lot of it just comes down to human error, and it's a hard thing for us to solve for in a bigger picture, but it doesn't mean it's not important for us to have a better understanding of those stats and stuff.
Confirmation bias. That's the word I was looking for.
Oh, yeah.
If something confirms what we're already thinking or what we already believe, then we're more likely to believe it. Mm-hmm. That's probably the majority of why fake news spreads as well as it does, and the alternative facts and everything. It's just there's just something in us that goes, yeah, I kind of believe that, and this fits with that. And that goes back to what we were talking about a couple weeks ago, with check your bias, and realizing that a lot of these things are written towards people's confirmation bias,
right?
Especially in the news and politics area. The thing I in my knowledge of science in general, this is I'm not a scientist, but in my knowledge of science in general, there are very few things that scientists as a whole count as truth. Everything is theories. Everything is true for now. Everything is set up, like even the theory of relativity. I mean, the theory of gravity. It's there. I mean, we believe it as truth now because nobody's disproven it for a very, very long time, but it's still presented as a theory. It's still presented in a way where it leaves it open, however small that crack in the door is open, it leaves it open for something, and that we don't apply that to most of the other areas of our lives.
Yeah. The thing that's interesting to me about that, though, is like, okay, so the theory itself, the way we define it, they're really good at holding that with like an open hand and saying like, we could disprove this. But at the same time, gravity as a truth is like, I could go out and experience that right now if I jumped off of something, right? Like there is a truth to that. Whether we figure out a way to define it better in the future is one thing, but the fact that if I jump off of something, I'm going to fall down is a truth. At least
whether we call it gravity or whether it's called something else in the future.
Right. So I think that there's part of that we have to accept, that's like, what is the root truth and what part of it is like the way that we define things and like our cultural context to define things. So like one of the examples I saw as I was kind of researching some things for this episode is like the idea of like absolute truth are things like there are no round triangles and no square circles. Well, that's true. Like
if it's a circle, it has to be no
like
corners.
There's no corners. If it's a square, there has to be corners. And so that's true. But, you'd get into an argument with some people. It's like, well, but what about a square with rounded corners or blah, blah, blah. But it's like, that's just the language that we use to define it. The truth is like a circle is a circle and a square is a square. And, we've used certain words to define that. And that's how we communicate to that as human beings. But that doesn't change the truth of those shapes or the fact that I would fall to the ground if I jumped off of something.
Or there's another one that I've seen. It's a quick little hand-drawn comic. Mm-hmm. A lot of times it's a kid at the playground looking at, it's either a number 6 or a number 9 drawn on the ground in chalk.
Yeah.
And there's 2 kids looking at it, one from each side.
Right.
So one sees a 9, one sees a 6, and they're obviously arguing about whether it's a 9 or a 6. Mm-hmm. They can argue whether their interpretation of it is a 9 or a 6 all day long, and the person who sees it from one side can't tell the other person that they are wrong, can't tell them that I'm wrong because I'm seeing this as a 9. Mm-hmm. However, to your point, whoever drew it as a 6 or a 9. So the truth is...
Or they drew it to be infuriating.
True. Third option. There you go. They drew it to be a certain number.
Yeah.
So the truth behind it is 6 or 9.
Sure.
It's just the interpretation. It's just the perspective on it, whatever we ascribe to it as potentially different.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's, it's just, this is something that I've been thinking about so I think there's kind of what I'll call like situational truth or these ideas of what we've been talking about with like politics and that kind of thing. Anything that would be brought to court or whatever, that there's this idea of that there has to be the real answer, crime dramas.
I was thinking, TV crime dramas.
We just got done watching some Elementary. That there's a right answer about what happened. Once we peel back the layers or what we may see or the motivations behind things, there's
the truth behind what happened, what actually happened.
Right, what actually happened. And I think the same thing's true in politics or whatever. And it's complicated. Like we watch a lot of John Oliver and if you haven't seen it, he really digs into certain issues and tries to help people understand what's really happening. But in a lot of those cases, like at the end of watching that, it's way more confusing to me than it was in the beginning. And so, I think that's something that we don't like as humans is the idea of like, if I dig into the truth, this is going to get less clear instead of more clear.
You know more about it. You're more informed,
right.
But that more information doesn't help you make up your mind.
Right. And then, moving from like situational truth into like the idea of relative or absolute truth and this idea of how do we, there's been kind of a shift, I think, in culture over, I don't know how many years because I don't know these things, but from this idea of like generally being accepted that there's an absolute truth that we can all get on board to it more being this idea of like we all have our own truth and live your own truth and sort of this relative idea of truth. But just thinking, to me there seems to be sort of this correlation between the idea of relative truth and like living your truth and the idea of like culture kind of being open to this idea of like, well, it may not exactly be true in politics, but I believe it anyway. And so it's like, how does that trickle down affect the way that we see news and see the internet and see our politicians and see whatever? And it's like, well, I'm sure there's people out there that believe like, well, if Trump says it's true, it must be true. It's like, well, no, that's not exactly how truth works, right? Like, so I just thinking about that and how the repercussions of that can really affect us as a culture when absolute truth is it's hard for us to prove.
It's super hard for us to prove, and that's where it gets hard. Whether we're talking about religion,
Right.
and certain religions claiming things as absolute truths that can't be proven, or
and a lot
that
of them contradictory.
right? Or like you said, when it comes down to our day-to-day lives, when it comes to politics or news or something like that, it's absolute truth is super hard to define, especially in some areas. And so that's where relativism and relative truth has come up. And, for the most part, a lot of times it's not too bad. Like, unless you're in an argument with somebody trying to convert somebody to your religion or your way of thinking, mm-hmm. in that case, you obviously can't put up with anything like the statement, "Oh, you just live your truth." Mm-hmm. No, I'm trying to convince you that there is something. If you're in that sort of argument, then you're kind of banging your head against the wall if that statement comes up. But for the most part, it's fine. And I shouldn't say fine. For the most part, we put up with it. We mm-hmm. put up with that statement because it generally doesn't hurt anybody. Like, I will say, somebody will say to me, "You live your truth." That's I don't want to talk about it. That's what you believe isn't hurting me.
Right.
Or isn't hurting somebody I love, or isn't hurting other people. It's not causing any harm. And so you live your truth. That's fine. I'll live my truth. Mm-hmm. And that's not an issue I want to talk about. Mm-hmm. That's kind of how it comes up. Mm-hmm. Or we use it when we're cheering somebody on. Mm-hmm. Like, I remember, one of the judges on The Voice used to use that. Was it Alicia Keys used to say that all the
Probably.
time? TV junkies here. I think she used to say that all the time when say a singer was a worship leader at a church and they would get up and sing a worship song that brought the crowd to their feet at the end of it, was really, really well done. And mm-hmm. then they'd say something about how their faith impacted how they sing that song. Mm-hmm. Alicia didn't agree with that statement, with the faith of that person, but she would say, "You live your truth,"
right,
in a way to say, "I'm encouraging you because I can get behind your voice, not mm-hmm. necessarily what you're saying." And so I think that statement, "Live your truth," it's kind of a cop-out in a lot of circumstances, but at the same time, it's positive and it's encouraging.
Yeah. But I also think it's a little bit dangerous in the conversation of really trying to get to the idea of truth.
It's totally dangerous in that situation.
Right. Because I was looking at some articles and just kind of, obviously I've heard a lot of people say live your truth, but just kind of getting an idea of like, what's the idea of live your truth as a whole? Like, what does it mean? And it's essentially this idea of like, you're your own person, own who you are. Like, a lot of it has to do with like personality or what you look like. I mean, it's essentially about self-confidence.
Sure.
And so while that's a great sentiment, and I absolutely believe in that, the idea of attaching like live your truth to that, it again distorts this word that we already have trouble defining. This idea of, this is the way that I envision my life, and that makes it truth. Now, in some cases, that's really good and self-affirming. And in some case, somebody could say, well, I want to be a raging alcoholic, and that's my truth. And, I guess we have a choice as people to say, well, okay, it's your truth and I can't change you. Or to say to that person, like, I don't believe that's the best way for you to live your life.
Or in that case, we come to a weird juxtaposition of using that phrase, because if somebody were a raging alcoholic and decided that they wanted to get clean, we would say, yeah, do that. And somebody would use that phrase, mm-hmm. live your truth. That's who you are. Move on from your past, right, and live how you want to live now. But then do you make that, to your argument, do you make that same statement to somebody who doesn't want to come clean?
Right. Or, I mean, maybe to use a even clearer analogy, like somebody who wants to murder people, I'm a serial killer and that's my truth. Well, I think it's pretty universally acceptable that that's not okay, And so, how do we reconcile that there's this idea of like, in my perception, this is an okay way to live. And so using that as an extreme example, like we can all get on board with I think we can all get on board with being a serial killer is not the best way to spend your life or use your life. But then there's all this gray area in the middle where
where 99.999% of the population lives.
Right.
If the truth is being a serial killer is wrong, that makes 99.999% of the population right throughout history. I mean, if that's the thing that we're pointing to as right and wrong, I suppose that kind of gets into categories of right and wrong and categories of truth, because you've got moral truth, which is there such thing as moral truth? Because morality is defined by societies and cultures differently, and it changes throughout history. I mean, you even look at America throughout our short history, and what is morally right and wrong has changed, and that plays into politics. That plays into how we live our day-to-day lives. Even in the short time that you and I have been alive, morality has changed drastically. And you can't argue that that's right or wrong.
Right.
I mean, and when you do, I'm going to loop this back to Trump. That's when you get that argument, make America great again, or anything like that, looking towards the past because that was better. That when you make that argument, then you're trying to discredit everything that's come up to this moment. Or if you're saying that what we're doing now is right, you're almost trying to discredit what's been happening in the past. I mean, that's morality, so that's a little bit different. There's different areas, but I think moral truth is where we most often get hung up.
Definitely.
In the live your truth sense. I mean, yeah, when you're talking about a positive affirmation and self-confidence, yeah, that's totally fine. Live your truth. Accept the way your mind works, accept the way your body works. Live within that. That's fine. But then when we get into the heavier stuff, the morality stuff, the faith, the religion, the core stuff to us, then
I don't know though. I'm going to go back to what you're saying about living your truth being fine, because I think the hard part about that is that even inside of that, there's tons of conflict. Like take for example, like if there was somebody who's like a hardcore health fanatic or a doctor, even dietitian or whatever, and for them, the idea of living your truth is like you need to exercise and eat a certain way, and if you weigh X amount of whatever, then you are not living your best life and whatever. And if they say that to me, and my perception of it is that I'm perfectly capable of all those things, but it's not how I choose to spend my life. And it doesn't mean that I choose to be unhealthy or I'm going to go and do things that I think are intentionally harmful. But I'm not going to spend 5 days a week in the gym and eat only kale for the rest of my life so that I can look a certain way or be a certain way. And so that would be my perception of the truth. So we even get into this idea of like, when we're using that as the way to define like, live your truth as basically it's live your life, then this idea is like, well, my truth is X and my truth is X and our truths don't really go together. And then I think the idea there is like, but it's all going to be okay. And we're not going to ruffle any feathers because, that's your truth and this is my truth. And we're just going to pretend like they can coexist in the world without any issues. But then I think we sort of scoot past this idea of like, well, then how do we all coexist together, without that creating issues? Because it does. Like if I want to coexist and be the person who's, not recycling anything and I throw everything away and I buy a ton of stuff that's
styrofoam and
sure, or
green.
Constantly buying new clothes and throwing them away or whatever, and then this other person over here is super environmentally conscious and that's their truth. Like it creates division at our core level. and we don't have a really good way to discuss that.
We don't. And that thing is different for everyone.
Right.
For the environmentalist person, they're going to argue whenever the issue of renewable energy or going green or recycling comes up, but they don't care about another issue that somebody else would care about. They don't care if you brought up the fact that you were a Buddhist or a Hindu, then they would be like, oh, whatever, doesn't affect me. But then that other person doesn't care about the environmental things that person cares about. And so it comes down to how we're present. I still kind of, I'll back down a little bit. I still kind of stand by the fact that I think saying live your truth is fairly innocuous sometimes.
Most of the time.
But you're right. We don't necessarily mean it like that. We're basically saying, good job. That's who you are.
You do you.
You do you, basically. So when it's in that context, that's more what I'm saying. It's fine. But you're right. When it does come down to bigger issues, whether we're talking about global warming or whether we're talking about some things in politics aren't that big of a deal, but a lot of things in politics are a big deal, or genocides in the world or big issues, you can't do that. You can't say live your truth as to the person who's killing people in Rwanda right now. You can't say that to those people. And so there is a breakdown where there is a line where we're willing to stop using that phrase. Right.
Well, and I think it gets really hard because there's so many things to know about and so many issues that are important in a lot of different ways. And I think it's hard. Like a lot of times we are in the way that society and culture is, there are probably 95% of issues that we have almost no opinion on compared to the experts in the fields.
Right.
And then there's our 5% of things that we're passionate about or drawn to or whatever. And because of the way that our society is built now and with the internet and stuff like that, what we have is those people that are in that 5%, pro and con, whatever issue, that can find each other and argue at a super high level.
Sure.
And so it just creates like tons of mountaintops that are, all we ever see is the experts in the pro side and the con side, or the whatever, however you want to phrase that.
And the rest of us who are caught in the middle of those two mountains, caught in the valley, who, if we hadn't seen that, wouldn't care about that issue. But all of a sudden we see it and we're like, oh, I care. And
I should care.
I should care, and I feel like I need to have an opinion. And so because I'm tangentially more related to this person on this mountaintop, I'm going to go with that opinion and research a bunch into that side of it. Or not even research a bunch into it, listen to this one person that I'm hearing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where it gets really interesting, because at least for me, what I found is like, there's always nuggets in there that for me either really resonate or I can apply. And I think where the real issue comes in is when we try to apply those things holistically, like this is the magical truth of a successful business or whatever.
This is the silver bullet for whatever issue I'm trying to fix.
And I talk a lot in my writing for work about how everybody wants a silver bullet. And I think it's the same thing when it comes to truth. We all want it to be so simplistic. We want to say, here's this nugget that contains everything that's truth in the world, and that's how it affects my life, and end of story. Now I can go on and live my life. But that's just not realistic.
But that's our lives aren't lived in a vacuum.
Right.
So what we're doing every week here is having a conversation that we hope carries on online. And that's why we've created our Facebook group. It's called Renovation Theory on Facebook. So go to Facebook and search for Renovation Theory to get involved in this conversation. We don't want it to be just us talking. And so after every episode, we post it on Thursdays. And then we also post a discussion question. And that's how we're ending each of our episodes. And so today we want to obviously ask a question about truth.
Yeah, I think what we want to really talk about is how can we work to expose truth or expose untruths in our conversations, in articles we see and things like that? What are different like tricks or things that you've tried that have really worked? And what are things that you find like harder to expose the truth or harder to push for the truth?
Are there certain areas where you find it harder? People are less receptive, maybe.
Right. Yeah. Anything like that. So, again, this is just meant to be a beginning point of our discussion. If you have a specific comment we made that you want to react to, or an area or of our discussion, or if there's just something that you think would add to the conversation as a whole, don't let our discussion or question of the week keep you from doing that. Yeah.
So thank you for making it this far. If you've made it this far, we appreciate you listening or watching. However you consume this podcast, we very much appreciate it. If you're not subscribed on YouTube or whatever podcast player you use, we'd appreciate it if you would subscribe.
Yeah.
You'll get a new episode every Thursday when we publish those. And we will see you next week.